Karen calls cops on man in Harris hat, then learns he's her new boss. How will the boss react? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The parking lot was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Cars sat still, their metal frames glinting under the bright afternoon sun. The air carried the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of birds, but otherwise, there was nothing, just the steady stillness of a typical day. Karen stood next to her car, one hand on her hip, the other gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She squinted into the sunlight, eyes narrowing as they landed on a man a few spaces away. He was leaning casually against a black luxury sedan, his broad shoulders relaxed, one ankle crossed over the other. In his left hand he held a leather portfolio, and perched on his head was a beige Harris hat with a black ribbon. The hat stood out to Karen. To her, it didn't belong here, not in this suburban parking lot outside the corporate offices she prided herself on running efficiently. It looked out of place, he looked out of place. Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line as she watched him. He hadn't moved in minutes. He wasn't checking his phone or walking to the building. He was just standing there. Like he was waiting. Like he had nowhere else to be. Karen's eyes darted back to her phone screen. She tapped it furiously, dialing a number she knew by heart. As she lifted the phone to her ear, her free hand fidgeted, tapping against the side of her thigh. The tension radiated off her like heat waves off the pavement. 911, what's your emergency? Came the crisp, professional voice on the other end of the line. Karen's tone was sharp, her words tumbling out in clipped bursts. Yes, hi. I'm at the corporate complex on 7th and Main. There's a man here. He's standing near the cars, just loitering. He doesn't look like he belongs here and he's being suspicious. The operator's voice remained calm. Can you describe the man for me, ma'am? Karen shot another glance at the man. He hadn't moved. He seemed to sense her staring because just then, he turned his head ever so slightly, his dark eyes locking onto her for the briefest of moments. The look he gave her was unreadable, calm, almost amused, like he knew something she didn't. It made her spine stiffen. He's tall, maybe mid-30s, Karen continued, now speaking louder, as if the volume of her voice could confirm the seriousness of the situation. He's wearing a dark suit and he has this hat. A Harris hat, I think it's called. And he's holding some kind of briefcase or portfolio. He's just standing there. It's strange. Is he doing anything threatening? The operator asked. Karen blinked as though the question threw her off. She glanced back at the man, watching as he adjusted the hat slightly and shifted his stance. He still didn't speak or move toward her. He just existed, calm, present, unapologetic. Well, no, she said, her voice faltering for half a second before she regained her usual confidence. But he shouldn't be here. I work in this building and I know everyone who's supposed to be coming and going. He's not one of them. He looks off. The operator asked for her name and reassured her that an officer would be dispatched. Karen ended the call with a relieved huff, the lines of tension on her face smoothing ever so slightly. She took one more look at the man, narrowing her eyes as if to say, "You'll see what happens now." The man, however, seemed unbothered. He tilted his head to the side, looking out across the rows of parked cars, and Karen swore she saw the faintest ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his lips. Karen muttered to herself under her breath as she marched toward the building, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. People think they can just show up wherever they want, not on my watch. As she pushed through the glass doors of the office building, the lobby's air conditioning hit her like a wall. It was refreshing, but it did little to cool the fire simmering in her chest. She still clutched her phone tightly like a weapon as she approached the reception desk. "Melissa," Karen barked, snapping her fingers to get the receptionist's attention. The young woman looked up from her computer, startled. "Yes, Karen?" Melissa replied, her voice uncertain. "There's a man out there in the parking lot," Karen said, jabbing a finger toward the glass doors. "He doesn't belong here and I've already called the police. When they arrive, send them straight to me." Melissa's brows knitted together. "A man? What's he doing?" Karen sighed, exasperated. "Nothing, that's the problem. He's just standing there like he owns the place. I don't recognize him and it's probably nothing good." Melissa hesitated before responding. "Maybe he's waiting for someone? Or maybe he's casing the place," Karen shot back. "We can't afford to take risks with security." The receptionist nodded, clearly unsure but unwilling to challenge Karen further. Karen turned on her heel, satisfied, and stormed toward the elevator. The glass walls of the lobby gave her one last look at the man as she passed. He hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away. The minutes stretched on as Karen sat at her desk, pretending to focus on her work. She typed furiously at her keyboard, even though her mind wasn't on the spreadsheets filling her screen. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the parking lot, back to that man in the Harris hat. Why was he still out there? What was he waiting for? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly and saw a text notification flash on the screen. It was from Melissa at the front desk. Police are here. They're heading outside now. Karen shot up from her chair so quickly that it nearly tipped over. She smoothed down her blouse and strode purposefully back to the lobby, her heels echoing in the hallway. By the time she reached the front desk, she could see two uniformed officers walking toward the man in the parking lot. Karen felt a grim satisfaction as she stopped near the glass doors, watching from a distance. Now he'll have to explain himself, she thought. Now we'll find out who he is. The officers approached the man, their posture assertive but not aggressive. One officer, a tall man with graying hair, started speaking. The other stood slightly to the side, one hand resting on his belt. Karen couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched with growing frustration as the man remained perfectly calm. He nodded as they spoke, his expression unreadable. Then something strange happened. The officer with graying hair seemed to stiffen, his brows pulling together as he listened to whatever the man said. He glanced down at a notebook in his hand, then back up at the man. Karen frowned. What's happening? She thought. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. The officers didn't look angry or suspicious. They looked confused, and now so was Karen. The conversation lasted a few more moments before the officers turned and walked briskly back toward the building. The man stayed where he was, adjusting his hat again and watching their retreat. Karen's jaw clenched. She was going to get answers. When the officers entered the lobby, she stepped forward immediately, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Well, she demanded. Did you figure out what he's doing here? The graying officer paused, studying her for a moment. Ma'am, that man isn't doing anything wrong. Karen blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? He's just standing there. He doesn't belong here. The officer's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Actually, he does. He's here on business. Business? Karen's voice faltered. Yes, the officer replied simply. But he asked that I let him explain it himself. Before Karen could respond, the officer turned and walked away, leaving her standing in stunned silence. She looked back out the glass doors. The man was still there waiting. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she stared out the glass doors. The man still hadn't moved. There he was, standing with that same maddening calm as if he knew something she didn't. She hated that look, that quiet confidence. Who was he? What kind of business could he possibly have here? Taking a deep breath, Karen squared her shoulders and stormed toward the parking lot. She didn't wait for Melissa or anyone else to stop her. This needed to be handled now. If the police won't do their job, she thought, I'll get answers myself. The hot afternoon sun beat down as she pushed through the doors. Her heels clicked against the pavement with every determined step, each sound echoing her rising frustration. Her eyes never left the man in the Harris hat as she approached. He still hadn't budged, still hadn't flinched. It was infuriating. Karen stopped a few feet away from him, her hands planted firmly on her hips. Excuse me, she barked, her voice sharp. What exactly are you doing here? The man lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time she got a closer look at his face. His sharp features were striking, his jawline clean and defined. He looked refined, polished. But there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite place. A quiet authority. The kind of presence that made people stop and listen. He didn't speak right away, which only made Karen more irritated. Instead, he studied her, his dark eyes calm and unreadable, like a man considering his next move. Did you hear me? Karen demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. I asked what you're doing here. Finally he spoke. His voice was deep and measured, every word deliberate. I'm waiting. For what? Karen snapped. His lips curved slightly, just the faintest trace of a smile. For someone to show a little patience. Karen's jaw tightened. Was he mocking her? She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but this is private property. If you're not supposed to be here, you need to leave. The man tilted his head slightly as if weighing her words. Then, to Karen's surprise, he straightened up and stepped toward her. His movements were smooth and confident, unhurried. And what makes you think I'm not supposed to be here? He asked calmly. Karen blinked. Because I work here, she shot back. I know everyone who comes in and out of this building, and I've never seen you before." The man raised an eyebrow as if he found her response amusing. "Interesting," he said softly. "And yet here I am." Karen felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. His calm demeanor only made her angrier. It was as though he wasn't taking her seriously, like she was some overzealous busybody who had made a mistake. "You think this is funny?" she snapped, stepping even closer. "Do you have any idea how suspicious you look just standing around like this? I called the police because people like you don't." She stopped mid-sentence, her words catching in her throat. The man's expression changed in an instant. The faint hint of amusement was gone, replaced by something sharper, something far more serious. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Karen felt a flicker of uncertainty. "People like me?" he repeated, his tone low and calm but edged with steel. Karen stammered. I didn't mean it like that." His gaze held hers, unrelenting. "No? Then what exactly did you mean?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time she felt small under his scrutiny, like he was seeing right through her. The man held her gaze for another long, tense moment before he stepped back, putting a deliberate distance between them. He adjusted his Harris hat with one hand, then nodded toward the building behind her. "Tell me," he said, his voice returning to that same calm, measured tone. "Do you often jump to conclusions without knowing the full story? Or am I just lucky today?" Karen's face burned with embarrassment. I didn't jump to conclusions," she muttered. "I was just concerned." The man looked at her for another long second before shaking his head slightly, as if he found her answer disappointing. "Concerned?" he repeated softly, almost to himself. Interesting choice of words. Before Karen could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw Melissa jogging toward them, looking flustered. The receptionist's face was flushed, and her breath came in short bursts as she slowed to a stop beside Karen. "Karen," Melissa panted, holding up a hand to steady herself. You need to come inside. Now." Karen frowned. What? "I'm in the middle of—" "Just come," Melissa interrupted, shooting a quick glance at the man. "It's important." The urgency in Melissa's voice made Karen pause. She glanced back at the man one more time as if to say, "This isn't over," before turning and following Melissa back toward the building. The man didn't stop her. He didn't call after her or explain himself. He just stood there watching, that quiet composure never faltering. Inside the office, Karen's heels clicked sharply against the tile as she stormed back into the lobby. Melissa stayed close behind, wringing her hands nervously as they approached the reception desk. "Would you mind telling me what's so urgent?" Karen demanded, throwing a glance over her shoulder. Through the glass doors she could still see the man standing in the parking lot, as calm as ever. Melissa swallowed hard. You're going to want to sit down?" Karen frowned. "Sit down? Why?" Melissa hesitated before answering. "Because that man, he's here to see Mr. O'Brien." Karen blinked, confusion knitting her brows. "O'Brien? As in, the CO?" Melissa nodded quickly. "Yes. And apparently he's important. Really important. Mr. O'Brien's been expecting him." Karen's stomach dropped. "What do you mean he's been expecting him?" Melissa bit her lip, glancing nervously between Karen and the glass doors. "I mean that he's here for a meeting. With the CO. Right now." Karen stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing. That man, the man she had called the police on, was here to meet with Mr. O'Brien? The CO? "That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. "It doesn't make sense. Who is he?" "I don't know," Melissa admitted. "But he told the police his name. It's Daniel Hart." Karen froze. "Wait, Daniel Hart," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Melissa nodded again. "Yes. Apparently he's the new regional director. The one Mr. O'Brien's been talking about all week." The words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, scrambling to make sense of it. Daniel Hart. The name wasn't unfamiliar, she had heard it several times over the last few days. Everyone in the office had been buzzing about the new hire. Mr. O'Brien had made a big deal about him during the last department meeting. He was supposed to be some hotshot executive who'd made a name for himself in the industry. He was going to oversee all regional operations. And now he was here. That man is Daniel Hart. The realization settled like a heavy weight in her chest. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she had to grip the edge of the reception desk to steady herself. "Oh no," she whispered. Melissa winced sympathetically. "Yeah. Oh no." Karen's mind reeled. She thought about the way she had marched outside, the way she had spoken to him, accused him, called the police on him. And all the while, he had just stood there, calm and composed, as if he knew exactly how it would end. Because he did know. He knew who he was. He knew why he was there. And now, so did she. Karen felt a wave of panic rise up inside her. This can't be happening, she muttered, more to herself than to Melissa. Melissa glanced nervously at the doors, where Daniel Hart was still visible, standing with that same quiet composure. Well, it is, she said softly. And I think you're going to have to talk to him. Karen's heart raced as she stood frozen at the reception desk. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a ton of bricks. This can't be happening, she thought again. There has to be some kind of mistake. Her eyes darted back to the parking lot, where Daniel Hart, the new regional director, her new boss, still stood. The Harris hat shaded his face, but Karen could still see that faint smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He wasn't smug. No, smugness implied arrogance, and there was none of that. Instead, he carried himself like a man who was in control. Calculated. And worse, he knew exactly what had happened. Karen? Melissa's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Are you okay? Fine, Karen snapped, though her voice betrayed her. I just need a second. Mr. O'Brien wants you in the conference room, Melissa added hesitantly. Daniel Hart is already on his way up. Karen's stomach twisted painfully. He's on his way up. The words rang in her ears like a death knell. She had to face him. There was no escaping this. Every step she had taken over the last hour, the accusations, the call to the police, the arrogance she'd shown, now hung over her head like a dark cloud. The embarrassment felt suffocating. She could already hear it, the whispers that would pass through the office once everyone found out what happened. Karen, the woman who prided herself on always being in control, had just made the worst possible mistake. She inhaled deeply, gathering whatever shards of composure she could muster. I'll handle this, she muttered under her breath, brushing past Melissa and marching toward the elevator. The elevator ride felt like the longest 30 seconds of Karen's life. The walls of the small space seemed to close in on her as she replayed the events of the morning over and over in her mind. She had been so sure, so absolutely certain, that the man in the parking lot was up to no good. She trusted her instincts, trusted herself. And now those same instincts had betrayed her. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors slid open to reveal the executive floor. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with glass conference rooms and private offices. At the far end of the hall, the large double doors of the main conference room were already propped open. Karen could see a group of people milling inside, including Mr. O'Brien, the CEO. And standing near the head of the table, speaking quietly to Mr. O'Brien, was Daniel Hart. Karen's legs felt like lead as she forced herself to walk down the hall. She kept her back straight and her chin lifted, determined not to let anyone see how rattled she felt. She would fix this. She had to fix this. When she stepped into the conference room, all eyes turned to her. Mr. O'Brien, a tall man in his 60s with sharp blue eyes and a permanent air of authority, smiled faintly and gestured for her to come forward. Karen, there you are, he said warmly. We were just waiting for you. Karen forced a tight smile, her gaze flickering to Daniel Hart. He stood beside Mr. O'Brien, his leather portfolio still tucked neatly under one arm. Up close he looked even more polished. The Harris hat sat perfectly atop his head, the black ribbon pristine. His suit, sharp and impeccably tailored, looked like it belonged to someone who had been at the top for years. And his expression? Calm, neutral, almost unreadable. Almost. Mr. Hart, Mr. O'Brien said, gesturing to Karen, this is Karen Mills, our operations manager. She's been with us for years, runs a tight ship and keeps everything moving like clockwork. Karen's heart sank further at the compliment. If only he knew, she thought miserably. Daniel Hart turned toward her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Karen, he said, his voice smooth and deep. Pleasure to meet you. I've heard good things. Karen swallowed hard. Thank you, she managed, though her voice sounded too tight, too forced. It's nice to meet you as well, Mr. Hart. He nodded slightly, as if he could hear every ounce of tension behind her words. Please have a seat, Mr. O'Brien said, gesturing to the conference table. Let's get started. Karen sank into the nearest chair, her pulse pounding in her ears as she watched Daniel Hart move to the head of the table. He set down his portfolio and removed his hat, placing it neatly beside him. He looked perfectly at ease, completely in control of the room. This morning's meeting is an introduction, Mr. O'Brien began. As most of you know, Mr. Hart will be stepping in as our regional director. He brings with him years of experience and an impressive track record in operations management. We're lucky to have him. Karen felt as though the words were directed at her specifically, like some cruel twist of fate. Lucky to have him, Mr. O'Brien said. Karen had just called the police on the man they were lucky to have. How was she ever going to recover from this? Daniel Hart took a step forward, his gaze sweeping the room. Thank you for the warm welcome, he began. I'm looking forward to working with all of you. My focus will be on streamlining operations across the region, identifying areas for growth, and improving our efficiency as a team. His voice was steady and confident, but Karen couldn't focus on the words. All she could hear was the ringing in her ears, the pounding of her own heartbeat as she sat there, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely he knew what had happened earlier. Surely he remembered her. And any moment now he was going to say something. He was going to call her out in front of the entire room. But he didn't. Instead, he continued speaking, outlining his plans for the next few months. Karen couldn't concentrate on a single word he was saying. She nodded along like the others, trying to look engaged, but inside, her thoughts were a whirlwind of panic. Does he know? She wondered. Of course he knows. How could he not? When Daniel Hart finally finished his presentation, Mr. O'Brien stood up and clapped him on the shoulder. Well done, Daniel. I think I speak for everyone here when I say we're excited to see what you'll bring to the table. Daniel inclined his head. Thank you. Mr. O'Brien turned to the group. Now, I know we all have work to get back to, so let's wrap this up. Karen, if you wouldn't mind staying back for a moment? I have a few things to discuss with you. Karen's stomach dropped. Of course, she thought. This is it. He's going to tell me he knows what happened. The other attendees filed out of the room, chatting quietly as they went. Karen stayed glued to her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the room was empty, Mr. O'Brien turned to Daniel Hart. Daniel, you're welcome to join us, Mr. O'Brien said. Karen's been leading our operations here for a long time, so I think it'll be good for you two to connect. Daniel nodded once, then looked straight at Karen. I agree. The air in the room grew impossibly thick as Daniel walked toward the table and took the seat directly across from her. Karen didn't dare meet his gaze. Her eyes stayed fixed on Mr. O'Brien, waiting for him to speak. Karen, Mr. O'Brien began, his tone kind but serious, I need you to help Mr. Hart get settled in. He's going to be reviewing all of our current systems and processes, and I want you to give him full access to everything he needs. Karen nodded stiffly. Of course. Mr. O'Brien smiled, seemingly oblivious to the tension between the two of them. I knew I could count on you. Daniel, anything you need, Karen's your go-to person. Daniel smiled faintly. I'll be sure to keep that in mind. Karen's face burned. She finally forced herself to look up, and when her eyes met Daniel's, she saw something in his expression. Something quiet and unreadable but undeniably knowing. It was as if he were saying, I haven't forgotten. Karen, Daniel said, his voice smooth, I'm looking forward to working closely with you. The words were polite enough, but there was an edge to them that only she seemed to notice. It sent a shiver up her spine. Likewise, she managed, though her voice felt hollow. Mr. O'Brien clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. Perfect. I'll let the two of you get started. Daniel, welcome aboard. With that, Mr. O'Brien left the room, leaving Karen alone with Daniel Hart. The door clicked shut behind Mr. O'Brien, and Karen was alone with Daniel Hart. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Karen felt it settle over her shoulders like a heavy weight as she gripped the edge of the table to keep her hands from trembling. Daniel sat calmly across from her, hands folded neatly on the table, his leather portfolio resting by his side. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her, his expression unreadable, like he was deciding what to say, or what not to say. Karen forced herself to meet his gaze, though it took everything she had. Karen, he said finally, his voice soft but firm, do you make a habit of calling the police on people you don't recognize? Karen flinched. There it was. The other shoe had dropped, and it was worse than she'd imagined. He wasn't going to sweep it under the rug or let her off the hook. He was going to make her face what she'd done. I didn't know who you were, she stammered, her voice tight. I was just trying to look out for the building. For security? Daniel raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. For security? Karen's face burned under his scrutiny. Yes. I didn't recognize you and you were just standing there. He tilted his head slightly as though weighing her words. And because I was just standing there, you assumed I was up to something. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. It's not like that. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving hers. No? Then tell me, Karen, what is it like? Because from where I'm sitting it seems pretty clear. Karen felt herself shrinking under his gaze. She was used to being the one in control, the one holding people accountable. But now she felt like she was the one on trial. I made a mistake, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean any harm. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. He just watched her, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. Mistakes happen, he said, his tone even. But this kind of mistake? It has consequences. Karen looked up sharply. Consequences? Yes, Daniel replied. Do you know how humiliating it is to be questioned by the police on your first day at a new job? To be treated like a criminal because someone made assumptions about you? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't thought about it like that, not really. She'd been so focused on her own embarrassment, her own mistake, that she hadn't stopped to consider how it might have felt for him. I'm sorry, she said finally, her voice soft. I really am. Daniel studied her for another long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe her. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Karen, he said, his voice calm but firm, I'm not here to hold a grudge. I'm here to do a job, to help this company grow and succeed. But if we're going to work together, there's one thing you need to understand. Karen swallowed hard. What's that? He held her gaze, his expression serious. Judging people before you know them is a dangerous habit. It leads to mistakes. Mistakes that can't always be undone. Karen nodded slowly, her face burning with shame. I understand. Good, Daniel said simply. Then he stood, picking up his portfolio and tucking it under his arm. Now, if you're ready, we have work to do. Karen blinked. What? You mean, now? Yes, now, Daniel replied, his tone matter of fact. Mr. O'Brien wants me to review the operations processes, and you're my point of contact. So let's get to it. Karen stared at him for a moment, stunned. She had expected him to drag this out, to lecture her or hold it over her head. Instead he was moving on. It was almost worse. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her blouse. Right. Of course. Let me show you to the operations center. Daniel nodded once. Lead the way. Karen led him down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile. Daniel walked beside her, his steps measured and unhurried. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence he'd shown earlier, and it only made Karen more self-conscious. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching them as they passed. She caught a few glances from co-workers peering out of their offices, their curiosity evident. No doubt the rumors were already spreading. Who is he? Why is he with Karen? When they reached the operations center, Karen pushed open the door and gestured for Daniel to enter. The room was large and bustling, filled with rows of desks, computers, and monitors displaying various data points. It was the nerve center of the company's day-to-day operations, and Karen had always prided herself on keeping it running like a well-oiled machine. This is where we monitor all our regional accounts and projects, Karen explained as they walked through the room. Each team has their own section. Data analysis, scheduling, reporting. Everything funnels through here. Daniel nodded as he surveyed the room. He didn't say much, but Karen could tell he was taking everything in, every detail, every system, every process. It made her nervous. She had always been confident in her work, but after the events of the morning, her confidence had been shaken. What if he found something wrong? What if he decided she wasn't as competent as Mr. O'Brien thought? Let's start with the reporting systems, Daniel said finally, turning to face her. I'd like to see how your team handles data management. Karen nodded quickly. Right. Of course. Follow me. She led him to one of the workstations, where a young employee named Josh was busy typing away at his computer. Josh looked up as they approached, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Daniel. Josh, Karen said briskly, this is Mr. Hart, our new regional director. He's here to review our operations processes. Josh nodded quickly, sitting up straighter in his chair. Nice to meet you, sir. Likewise, Daniel replied, his tone polite but professional. Can you walk me through your current reporting process? Sure, Josh said, turning back to his screen. We use a combination of automated data pulls and manual input to compile our reports. Everything gets consolidated into this dashboard here, where we can track performance metrics in real time. Daniel stepped closer, studying the screen with interest. And how often do you update these reports? Daily, Josh replied. We run the data pulls overnight, so by the time the team comes in, everything is up to date. Daniel nodded, clearly satisfied. Good. And what about error checks? How do you ensure the data is accurate? Josh hesitated, glancing at Karen as though unsure how to answer. Karen stepped in quickly. We have a two-step verification process, she explained. One team member runs the initial report, and another team member reviews it for accuracy before it gets finalized. Daniel turned to her, his expression neutral. Does that process work well? Are there many errors? Karen straightened her shoulders, determined to project confidence. Our error rate is low, less than 2%. It's a system we've refined over the years. Daniel nodded slowly as if considering her words. Good to know. Karen felt a small flicker of relief. So far so good. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as she thought. Daniel turned back to Josh. Thank you for your time, he said. Keep up the good work. Josh beamed. Thank you, sir. As they walked away from the workstation, Karen felt herself relax slightly. Daniel hadn't torn anything apart, yet. Maybe he wasn't here to find fault. Maybe he really was just here to get a sense of how things operated. But then Daniel spoke, his tone calm but pointed. Your team seems competent, Karen. But I noticed something during that conversation. Karen's heart sank. What's that? He glanced at her, his dark eyes sharp. You said the error rate is less than 2%. But I didn't hear any mention of how you measure that. Karen blinked, caught off guard. Well, we track errors manually. And how do you define an error? Daniel pressed. Is it a discrepancy in the data? A missed deadline? Something else? Karen hesitated. She had never thought about it in such specific terms. It's a combination of those things, she said finally. Daniel nodded as though her answer confirmed something for him. Interesting. I'll want to take a closer look at that later. Karen bit the inside of her cheek to keep herself from reacting. Of course he would, she thought. Nothing slips past him. Karen followed Daniel as he moved toward another section of the operations center, her heart pounding. His questions had been sharp, precise, cutting through her confidence like a knife. It wasn't just what he asked, but the way he asked it. Calm, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. And worse, he wasn't wrong. Karen had never given much thought to how errors were defined in their reports. The system worked well enough, or so she'd always thought. But Daniel clearly wasn't satisfied with good enough. He was looking for something more, something better. And that terrified her. Karen, Daniel said, breaking the silence as they approached the next row of workstations. What's your process for team accountability? Karen blinked, thrown off by the sudden question. Accountability? Yes, Daniel said, turning to face her. How do you ensure that everyone on your team is pulling their weight? That deadlines are met, tasks are completed, and responsibilities are handled? Karen hesitated, feeling her face flush. Well, we have regular check-ins, she said quickly. I meet with each team lead once a week to review progress and address any issues. Daniel nodded, but he didn't look impressed. Weekly check-ins, he repeated softly as though testing the words. And what happens in between? In between? Karen frowned. Yes, Daniel said, his gaze steady. What happens if an issue comes up on a Monday, but the check-in isn't until Friday? How do you catch problems before they escalate? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but she didn't have an answer. She had always assumed the team would flag any problems on their own. That was part of being a professional, wasn't it? You handled your responsibilities. You didn't need someone looking over your shoulder every minute of the day. We trust our team to bring issues forward, she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. They know they can come to me if there's a problem. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes still locked on hers. Trust is important, he said evenly. But trust without structure is a recipe for oversight. Karen flinched at the word oversight. It hit like a slap. Was he saying she was negligent? That she wasn't doing her job properly? I've been running this team for years, Karen said defensively. We've been meeting our targets, and our performance metrics have been solid. I don't doubt that, Daniel replied smoothly. But solid performance isn't the same as optimal performance, is it? Karen's jaw tightened. I don't see how that's fair, she muttered, unable to stop herself. I've worked hard to get this team where it is. Daniel regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, his voice softened slightly. I'm not questioning your hard work, Karen. I'm questioning whether there's room to improve. Isn't that what leadership is about? Karen didn't respond. She couldn't. Because deep down she knew he was right. She'd been so caught up in defending herself and holding on to her authority that she hadn't stopped to think about what he was actually saying. He wasn't attacking her, he was challenging her. And it stung because she didn't have an answer. Daniel must have sensed her hesitation because he changed the subject. "Let's move on," he said simply. "I'd like to see your scheduling system." Karen exhaled slowly, trying to collect herself as she led him toward the back of the room, where the scheduling team sat. She didn't trust herself to speak. Every question he asked made her feel like she was under a microscope, every decision she'd ever made being scrutinized. She'd spent years building this team, earning the respect of her co-workers and climbing the corporate ladder. And now, in the span of a single day, this man had managed to make her doubt herself. It wasn't fair. He hadn't been here for the late nights, the impossible deadlines, the sacrifices she'd made. What right did he have to question her? By the time they finished reviewing the operations center, Karen felt utterly drained. She led Daniel back to her office, hoping, praying, that he was done for the day. But if Daniel was tired, he didn't show it. He still looked calm, composed, and entirely in control. "Have a seat," Karen said stiffly, gesturing to one of the chairs in front of her desk. She moved behind the desk and sank into her chair, trying to put a barrier between them. She needed to regain some sense of authority, some sense of herself. Daniel sat down, placing his portfolio on his lap. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her office, the framed awards on the walls, the neatly organized desk, the small stack of reports waiting to be filed. Karen couldn't tell what he was thinking, and it drove her crazy. "Your team is good," Daniel said finally. "Competent. Dedicated." Karen blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "Thank you. But," Daniel continued, his gaze meeting hers, "there's room for improvement. And I think you know that." Karen felt her stomach twist. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want you to work with me," Daniel replied. "I want to identify areas where we can streamline processes, improve accountability, and optimize performance. And I want you to be a part of that." Karen frowned. "You want me to help you fix things?" "Not fix," Daniel corrected. "Improve. There's a difference." Karen stared at him, searching his expression for any sign of condescension or pity. But there was none. He wasn't talking down to her. He wasn't trying to undermine her. He was inviting her, bringing her into the process. "Why me?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why not someone else?" "Because you know this team better than anyone," Daniel said simply. "You've been running it for years. You have the experience and the insight to make a real difference. I don't want to replace you, Karen. I want to work with you." Karen's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. After everything that had happened, after the embarrassment, the tension, the pointed questions, she had assumed Daniel saw her as an obstacle, an adversary. But now, sitting across from him, she realized that wasn't the case. He wasn't trying to tear her down. He was trying to build something better. And he wanted her to be a part of it. For a moment, Karen didn't know what to say. She looked down at her desk, at the papers scattered across its surface. She thought about her team, the people who relied on her. She thought about the systems she'd put in place, the routines she'd spent years refining. And she thought about Daniel's words. "Trust without structure is a recipe for oversight." It stung because it was true. She had been relying on trust, on the assumption that everything would keep running smoothly because it always had. But maybe that wasn't enough. Maybe good enough wasn't good enough anymore. Finally, she looked up, meeting Daniel's gaze. "Okay," she said quietly. "Where do we start?" Daniel's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "We start by identifying the gaps. The places where things fall through the cracks. I'll need your help with that." Karen nodded slowly. "All right. Good," Daniel said, standing and picking up his portfolio. "I'll be back tomorrow morning. Think about what we discussed today and let's hit the ground running." Karen stood as well, watching as Daniel walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob and glanced back at her. "And Karen," he said. "Yes. Next time you see someone you don't recognize, maybe try introducing yourself before you call the police." Karen's face turned crimson. "Right. Got it." Daniel gave her a small nod, then walked out, leaving her standing alone in her office. When Karen finally sat back down at her desk, she let out a long, shaky breath. She felt like she'd been through a battle. Mentally, emotionally, and even physically. Every interaction with Daniel had been like walking a tightrope, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her balance. But as she sat there, staring at the blank computer screen in front of her, she felt something else, something unexpected. Determination. Daniel Hart had come in and shaken everything up. He'd asked hard questions, poked holes in systems she thought were airtight, and made her confront her own shortcomings. It had been uncomfortable, embarrassing, infuriating even. But it wasn't the end. If anything, it was a beginning. Karen straightened her shoulders, her lips pressing into a thin line of resolve. She wasn't going to let this defeat her. She wasn't going to let herself be pushed aside or written off. She had built this team and she was going to fight for it. If Daniel wanted her to help improve things, fine. She would. And she'd prove to him, and to herself, that she was up for the challenge. With that thought, she reached for the stack of reports on her desk and started reviewing them, her mind already buzzing with ideas. Karen worked late into the evening, the hum of the operations center slowly fading as her team trickled out for the day. The office was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of a chair or the distant sound of a printer spitting out paper. She sat at her desk, surrounded by open folders, scattered notes, and her laptop, its screen glowing in the dim light. Her thoughts swirled, tangled up in everything Daniel Hart had said. Trust without structure. Good isn't always optimal. His words echoed in her mind, making her question things she had never questioned before. For years she had been confident, sure, that her systems worked. And yet Daniel had seen cracks in them within hours. That shook her more than she cared to admit. But more than anything, it was the way he had handled the situation earlier that gnawed at her. He could have humiliated her. He could have called her out in front of Mr. O'Brien, in front of the team. But he didn't. Instead, he challenged her quietly, forcing her to see the bigger picture for herself. Karen leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. What am I even doing? She thought. How had things gotten so far out of her control? She had always prided herself on being the one with the answers. The one who was decisive, efficient, unshakable. But now she felt like she was standing on shaky ground. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her from her thoughts. Karen glanced at the screen and groaned quietly. It was a text from Melissa. Melissa, Daniel Hart just left the building. He asked me to remind you that he'll see you at 8 a.m. tomorrow sharp. Good luck, LOL. Karen sighed. 8 a.m. sharp. Of course he'd want to get started first thing. She didn't know whether to be annoyed by his relentless work ethic or impressed by it. Probably both. With a resigned groan, she pushed herself up from her chair and began gathering her things. She couldn't undo the events of the day, but she could make sure tomorrow was different. If Daniel Hart wanted to see improvement, she would show him improvement. She wouldn't let him catch her off guard again. The next morning, Karen arrived at the office before sunrise. The sky outside was still dark, streaked with faint hints of orange and purple as the city began to wake. She had barely slept, but she didn't care. She had spent most of the night reviewing reports, double-checking processes, and drafting ideas for improving the operations center. By the time 8 a.m. rolled around, Karen was seated at her desk, her notes neatly stacked, a fresh cup of coffee within reach. She wouldn't admit it out loud, but she was ready to prove to Daniel and maybe to herself that she was capable of rising to the challenge. Right on cue, the elevator chimed and Daniel Hart stepped into the office. He was dressed just as impeccably as the day before. Dark suit, perfectly polished shoes, and that Harris hat perched atop his head. He moved with the same quiet authority, his presence commanding attention without a word. "Good morning, Karen," he said as he approached her desk. "Good morning," Karen replied, forcing a small smile. "I hope you're ready. I have some things to show you." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "I'm listening." Karen gestured to the stack of notes in front of her. "I spent last night reviewing our processes and identifying areas where we can improve. I've drafted a list of changes I think would address some of the concerns you raised yesterday." Daniel's lips twitched as though he were fighting back a smile. "You've been busy?" Karen straightened in her chair, determined not to let him throw her off. "I wanted to be prepared." "I appreciate that," Daniel said simply. "Let's see what you've got." Karen launched into her presentation, walking Daniel through her findings step by step. She started with the reporting process, outlining ways to streamline data verification and reduce the risk of errors. Then she moved on to team accountability, suggesting daily check-ins to catch problems earlier and improve communication between departments. Finally, she proposed a new system for defining and tracking errors, one that would provide clearer metrics and allow for faster course correction. Throughout it all, Daniel listened attentively, asking occasional questions but never interrupting. His calm, focused demeanor made Karen more nervous than she cared to admit, but she pushed through it. She had worked hard on this and she wasn't going to let him see her falter. When she finally finished, she sat back in her chair and waited, her heart pounding. Daniel didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied her notes, flipping through the pages with a critical eye. Karen held her breath, waiting for his verdict. Finally, he looked up and to her surprise he nodded. "This is good," he said, his voice even. "You've put a lot of thought into this?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. "You think so?" "Yes," Daniel said. "It's a solid start. There are still some details to iron out, but I can see where you're going with this." Karen felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. "What kind of details?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Your daily check-ins, for example. How do you plan to implement them without disrupting the team's workflow?" Karen hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. I was going to discuss it with the team leads and get their input." Daniel nodded, clearly pleased with her answer. "Good. Involving the team will make the transition smoother." Karen exhaled slowly, trying not to show how much his approval meant to her. It wasn't much, just a small nod here, a brief word of encouragement there, but it was enough. Enough to make her feel like she was moving in the right direction. "I want you to keep working on this," Daniel said, standing up. "Refine the details, get feedback from the team, and start putting these changes into action. I'll check in with you at the end of the week to see how things are progressing." Karen nodded quickly. "Understood." Daniel picked up his portfolio and adjusted his hat, giving her one last look before he turned to leave. "Good work, Karen," he said over his shoulder. "Keep it up." Karen sat there for a moment after he left, staring at the stack of notes in front of her. Good work. Two simple words, but they meant everything. Coming from Daniel Hart, they felt like validation, proof that she wasn't out of her depth after all. She allowed herself a small smile before turning back to her computer. She had work to do. The next few days flew by in a blur of activity. Karen threw herself into her work with a newfound sense of purpose, determined to prove herself to Daniel, and to herself. She met with the team leads, presenting her ideas and gathering their feedback. She worked late into the night, refining processes, updating systems, and addressing concerns. And through it all, Daniel was there, watching, asking questions, and pushing her to think harder, to dig deeper. He was demanding but never unfair. He didn't tell her what to do, he challenged her to figure it out for herself. On Thursday afternoon, as Karen sat at her desk reviewing the latest set of performance metrics, Daniel appeared in the doorway of her office. She looked up, startled but quickly recovered. "Mr. Hart," she said. "What can I do for you?" Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable as always. "I wanted to check in," he said. "How are things progressing?" Karen gestured to the papers on her desk. "We've made a lot of progress," she said. "The new daily check-ins have already started, and the team leads have been great about flagging issues earlier. I've also implemented a clearer definition of errors and we're tracking them in a new system. It's still early, but so far the feedback has been positive." Daniel nodded slowly as though considering her words. "Good. That's what I like to hear." Karen couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Thank you." Daniel studied her for a moment, his dark eyes sharp. "You've done well, Karen," he said finally. "Better than I expected." Karen blinked, startled. "You didn't expect me to do well?" "I didn't know what to expect," Daniel said simply. "But you've impressed me." Karen didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, she looked down at her desk, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. Daniel inclined his head. "Keep it up," he said, turning to leave. "We're just getting started." As he walked away, Karen sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. "We're just getting started." The words sent a thrill of excitement through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was growing, not just as a manager but as a leader. And it was because of him. Daniel Hart, she thought. The man in the Harris hat. My new boss. By Friday morning, the office buzzed with energy. The week had been long and challenging, but Karen felt a sense of momentum she hadn't experienced in years. The new systems were already starting to take root, and the team was responding better than she expected. The check-ins had improved communication, errors were being flagged earlier, and team leads were feeling more proactive. Karen stood near the operations center, watching as her employees moved with renewed purpose. It was subtle. Most wouldn't notice the change unless they were looking for it, but Karen did. There was less hesitation in the way people moved, less frustration when problems arose. It was as though a weight had been lifted off the team's shoulders. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Daniel approaching, his leather portfolio under his arm and his Harris hat perched perfectly atop his head. The man had a way of moving through a room that commanded attention without demanding it. Karen straightened her posture instinctively as he stopped beside her. "How's it looking today?" Daniel asked, his gaze sweeping the room. Karen smiled faintly. "Better. The new check-ins are helping." The team leads have been catching issues earlier, and I've seen a noticeable drop in errors. Daniel nodded, his expression calm. Good. Karen hesitated, then decided to speak up. I'll admit, I wasn't sure how the team would react to the changes. I thought they'd push back. They still might, Daniel replied evenly. Change isn't easy. People resist it even when it's for the better. It's your job to show them why it matters. Karen nodded, mulling over his words. You seem to know a lot about this. Daniel glanced at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It's not my first rodeo. Karen raised an eyebrow. Is that your way of saying you've done this before? Daniel's smile widened slightly, though it never reached his eyes. Something like that. Karen studied him for a moment, curious. You don't talk much about yourself, do you? Daniel's expression grew neutral again, as though he were closing a door. I don't see the point. Karen frowned. The point is people like to know who they're working with. Where you come from, what you've done. Those things matter. Daniel regarded her for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers. Finally he spoke. I spent a lot of years fixing broken systems, Karen. I've seen what happens when leadership gets complacent, when people assume good enough is good enough. I've seen companies crumble because no one was willing to ask the hard questions. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. Something heavy, something real. Karen didn't know what to say. She had spent the week feeling like Daniel was pushing her, challenging her, but now for the first time she saw why. This wasn't just a job to him. It was something deeper. I get it, she said softly. You're here to make sure that doesn't happen. Yes, Daniel replied simply. And I need people like you to help me. Karen looked at him, startled. People like me? Daniel nodded. You care about this team, Karen. I can see it. You've worked hard to build something here, and that matters. But hard work isn't enough on its own. You have to be willing to evolve. Karen swallowed hard, his words hitting her square in the chest. You have to be willing to evolve. He was right, of course. She had spent years building her team, refining her systems, but she hadn't stopped to ask if they could be better. And the truth was, she had grown comfortable. She had assumed that good enough was good enough. Not anymore. Okay, she said finally, her voice steady. I'm with you. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as though he were considering her response. Good. The day flew by, filled with meetings, check-ins, and data reviews. Karen moved through it all with a sense of purpose, fueled by Daniel's words. By the time the sun began to set, the office had mostly emptied, but Karen remained at her desk, finishing up the last of her reports. She was reviewing a particularly complex data set when a soft knock at the door made her look up. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hat in one hand and his portfolio in the other. You're still here, he observed. Karen smiled faintly. So are you? Daniel stepped inside, his movements unhurried. I wanted to check in before I left. How did today go? Better, Karen said honestly. The team's adjusting to the changes faster than I expected. I think we're on the right track. Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. Good to hear. He stood there for a moment, looking at her, as though he were debating whether to say something. Finally he spoke. You've come a long way this week, Karen. Karen blinked, startled. I have? Yes, Daniel said. I didn't expect you to adapt as quickly as you have. Most people would have pushed back, dug in their heels. But you didn't. You stepped up. Karen felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. I had to. No, Daniel said firmly. You didn't have to. You could have resisted. You could have refused to change. But you didn't. That's what makes you a leader. Karen stared at him, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to praise, not like this. It wasn't empty or shallow. It was real, and it meant more than she wanted to admit. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel nodded, then glanced at his watch. You should head home. It's been a long week. Karen smiled faintly. I'll leave when you do. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is that a challenge? Maybe, Karen replied, her smile widening slightly. For a moment, Daniel just looked at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. Then he shook his head, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. Good night, Karen. Good night, Daniel. He turned and walked out of her office, his footsteps echoing down the quiet hallway. Karen sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. She felt different, lighter somehow, like the weight of the past week had finally started to lift. You have to be willing to evolve. She thought about those words as she gathered her things and turned off the lights. Daniel had been right. Change was hard. It was uncomfortable. But it was also necessary. And for the first time in a long time, Karen felt like she was ready for it. The following Monday, the office felt different. There was a sense of energy in the air, a renewed focus that Karen hadn't seen in years. People were communicating better, solving problems faster, and working together more efficiently. The systems she and Daniel had implemented were already making a difference, and Karen couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she watched it all unfold. She was standing in the middle of the operations center, talking with one of the team leads, when she heard someone clear their throat behind her. She turned to see Daniel standing there, his leather portfolio in hand. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," Karen replied, smiling faintly. "Here to check on us?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Is that a problem?" Karen shook her head. "Not at all. I think you'll like what you see." Daniel glanced around the room, taking it all in. His expression didn't change, but Karen could see the faint hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "It's a good start," he said finally. Karen smirked. "Careful, Daniel. If you're not careful, people might think you're impressed." Daniel shot her a look, but there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Karen laughed softly. It wasn't the first time she had joked with him, but it was the first time he'd let his guard down enough to respond. It was subtle, but it was progress. And Karen would take it. As the day wore on, Karen found herself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past week. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago she had been standing in the parking lot, calling the police on the man who would become her new boss. It felt like a lifetime ago. Daniel Hart had come into her life like a storm, unpredictable, powerful, and impossible to ignore. He had challenged her, pushed her, and forced her to confront things she had been avoiding for years. It hadn't been easy. It had been uncomfortable, frustrating, and at times humiliating. But it had also been exactly what she needed. As Karen sat at her desk, watching her team work together more effectively than ever, she realized something. Daniel had made her a better leader. And for that, she was grateful. By the end of the second week, the changes in the office were impossible to ignore. Processes that had once felt sluggish were now running smoothly, communication had improved, and the team's morale seemed higher. It wasn't just the numbers. Karen could feel the difference. People weren't just doing their jobs anymore, they were taking pride in their work. Karen sat at her desk late one afternoon, reviewing the latest performance metrics. The error rate had dropped significantly, down to nearly zero. Deadlines were being met consistently, and projects were moving faster than before. She couldn't help but smile as she jotted down notes in her planner. Maybe Daniel was right, she thought. Sometimes change really is necessary. The sound of a knock at her office door made her look up. Daniel stood in the doorway, his Harris hat tucked under one arm. As always, he looked polished and composed, his expression calm but serious. "Busy?" he asked. Karen shook her head. "Come in." Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Karen watched him curiously, waiting for him to speak. "You've done good work here, Karen," he said finally, his voice low. Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you." Daniel turned to face her, his dark eyes steady. "It's not just the systems. It's the way you've handled the team. They trust you. That's not easy to build." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected compliment. "I care about them," she said simply. "I want this place to succeed. I want them to succeed." Daniel nodded as though he had expected that answer. "That's what makes you different?" Karen frowned slightly. "Different how?" "Most people resist change because they're afraid of losing control," Daniel explained, moving to sit in the chair across from her. "But you embraced it. You adapted. That's the mark of a real leader." Karen looked down at the papers on her desk, feeling her cheeks flush. She wasn't used to this, being recognized, being praised. "I didn't think I had much of a choice," she admitted. "You came in and shook everything up. I had to adapt." Daniel's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "You always have a choice. You could have resisted me. Fought me every step of the way. Plenty of people do." Karen tilted her head, studying him. "Is that what usually happens?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "More often than not." "And what happens to those people?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "They get left behind." Karen swallowed hard, his words landing like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. Change was inevitable, and those who refused to evolve were always the first to fall. "I don't want to get left behind," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I know. That's why you won't be." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Karen spoke. "What about you?" she asked. You came in here and turned everything upside down, but you never talk about yourself. Why do you do this? Why do you go from company to company fixing broken systems? Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Because someone has to, he said finally. That's not an answer, Karen pressed. Not really. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. I've seen what happens when leadership gets lazy, he said quietly. I've seen companies fall apart because no one was willing to ask the hard questions. I've seen people lose their jobs, their livelihoods because of complacency. He paused, his gaze distant as though he were remembering something. I watched it happen to my father, he continued. He worked for a company that fell apart because the people at the top weren't paying attention. They ignored the warning signs until it was too late. He lost everything. Karen stared at him, stunned. She hadn't expected that. Daniel always seemed so composed, so untouchable. But now, for the first time, she saw the man behind the calm exterior, the man who had been shaped by loss, by experience. I'm sorry, she said softly. Daniel shook his head. Don't be. It taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Complacency is the enemy. If you want to survive, if you want to succeed, you have to be willing to change. Karen nodded slowly, his words sinking in. That's why you push people so hard. Yes, Daniel said simply. Because I don't want to see it happen again. Karen sat back in her chair, letting his words settle. It all made sense now, the way he challenged her, the way he refused to let anything slide. He wasn't doing it to tear her down. He was doing it to build something better. You've made a difference here, Karen said finally. I hope you know that. Daniel met her gaze, his expression softening ever so slightly. So have you? The weeks turned into months, and the changes Daniel and Karen implemented continued to pay off. Performance metrics were at an all-time high, the error rate had dropped to nearly zero, and team morale had never been better. The company was thriving, and Karen felt a renewed sense of pride in her work. But more than that, she felt like she had grown. Daniel had pushed her, challenged her, and forced her to confront things she had been avoiding for years. And as uncomfortable as it had been, she was grateful for it. She was a better leader now, more confident, more capable, and more willing to embrace change. One afternoon, Karen stood in the operations center watching her team work. The hum of conversation, the clicking of keyboards, the buzz of activity, it was a symphony of progress, and Karen couldn't help but smile. She turned to see Daniel standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with the same calm intensity he always carried. Not bad, he said, his voice low. Karen smirked. Careful, Daniel. If you're not careful, people might think you're impressed. Daniel raised an eyebrow, though there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. Don't push your luck. Karen laughed softly, shaking her head. Admit it, you're impressed. Daniel regarded her for a moment, then nodded. I am, he said simply. Karen blinked, surprised. Really? Yes, Daniel replied. You've done good work here, Karen. You've proven yourself. Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel nodded, then glanced at his watch. I have a meeting with Mr. O'Brien. I'll see you later. As he turned to leave, Karen called after him. Hey, Daniel? He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Yes. She smiled faintly. I'm glad you're here. For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his expression softening. Then he nodded once. So am I. And with that, he walked away, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the operations center, surrounded by the hum of progress. She watched him go, her smile widening slightly. The man in the Harris hat, the man she had once called the police on, had turned out to be exactly what the company needed. Exactly what she needed. And as she turned back to her team, watching them work with purpose and pride, Karen realized something. Change wasn't the enemy. Complacency was. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next.